Cool. So, welcome everyone to the post brainstorming week research meeting. Um,
Yeah, are
yeah,
you going to summarize the 20 hours of research in the next couple minutes?
yeah, that's kind of the idea. Although, yeah, it's not going to be any particularly kind of concise overview or whatever. It's more kind of working through the notes we wrote last week and kind of the sort of provisional conclusions we came to um, about object behaviors, and then we're probably going to disagree and argue about some of those, and then so it'll also be kind of like a new, like I'm sure there'll be new discussion points that come up because of that. Um, but yeah, I guess Tristan and Will, did you guys you probably haven't had a chance to watch any of the stuff?
No, I haven't. I
Um,
haven't. I was ill yesterday. I didn't do anything.
yeah, okay. Um, like I said, just for kind of interest, so this was kind of the first time we did one of these brainstorming weeks that was entirely remote. We had 4 days, and it was like a 4 hour session where we would um, kind of brainstorm on our own and think through ideas, and then a 4 hour session where we would meet up and discuss everything. And we had some of that kind of discussion that happened through the medium of PowerPoint, but a lot of it was using ExcaliDraw, which was kind of exciting to see that working well in terms of sort of remote whiteboarding. Um, and yeah, Vivian's kind of added some helpful boxes showing kind of the different days, but you can see how we kind of progressed like sort of mad scientists through these various kind of concepts here. And yeah, I think it would be too much to try and go through all of this again, and would be kind of treading too much of the same ground. But what we were also doing while we were brainstorming is at the end of each kind of day, we tried to, so I should say we were being guided by these kind of questions we have here in this document, these open questions. And at the end of the day, if we kind of felt like there were some things that we discussed that sounded reasonable, we basically wrote them down in this kind of gray text to convey that this is a provisional conclusion or kind of idea that we should kind of remember. And so the main idea today was to go through this text, check if there's any disagreement or confusion. And then I think where relevant, we can refer to the kind of diagrams or figures that kind of informed this discussion. But yeah, what is that? Any questions or comments?
I guess I mean, this will probably take the whole meeting already, but if there's more time, I thought a bit more through the proposal I made last time about the object distortions.
Okay,
Um,
nice.
and thought of an issue with it that I could talk through briefly and a potential solution, but yeah, no worries if we don't get to that.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound interesting. And so for context, to those who weren't there last week, yeah, there was a few different ideas discussed, but probably the biggest, kind of most important one was one Vivian proposed in the last day for how we could have these kind of distortion maps, and that those could be kind of, oh, no, not what I wanted to click on. Where's this? Um, yeah, so that's kind of what's conveyed here. Obviously, there's a lot to it, but at a kind of high level, it's taking some of the concepts that we had for kind of how a parent can influence the information coming into a child learning module and kind of bringing that into one learning module as a way of dealing with things like object distortions like this. Yeah, I'm kind of, I don't know, in some ways it could be nice to start with that because I feel like we could always go through these comments offline, whereas we can't kind of do the kind of discussion that you're proposing offline, where that's
Um,
harder. But
we can also start at the top of the open questions, and then I think we'll naturally get to the one around object distortions, and then I could go
okay,
over
cool.
the
At that point,
proposal.
sounds
Yeah,
good.
yeah, I don't want to take away from kind of the summary.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, the kind of first thing we were looking at was how we kind of would actually learn in a kind of reasonable amount of time. Object behaviors, as we've discussed many times, it's challenging to do that given their complexity, as well as kind of how we kind of quickly do things like inference and the relationships of voting. And one of the things we thought a lot about, kind of, or kind of talked about on and off beforehand, was if there's some sort of kind of sharing of knowledge across columns, and how that might enable a more efficient learning. So we ended up having like a fairly extensive discussion about the role of hierarchy for learning, and in particular learning at highest level of hierarchy. It wasn't actually that much related to object behaviors, but I think it was still an interesting discussion about, we don't have it here, but yeah, an interesting discussion about learning. But basically, yeah, so what we wrote, let's see.
I think the reason it wasn't that related is because the solution will apply to both static and behavior objects, and it was easier to talk about the static objects, but
Yeah,
the
it would
reason, like the
still,
problem becomes more apparent with behavior models, that it's like so difficult to observe everything on a behavior.
right,
Yeah.
right. So let's see, in typical fashion, already the first sentence, slightly confused by the wording. We can use hierarchy to infer objects with a column that hasn't learned the object yet. That doesn't make sense. As in, let's see, this means we can remove the requirement for all the low-level columns to learn a model of each object. They will only learn the objects through higher repetition, but we can already make predictions based on models that will learn quickly in higher regions. I think what this is meant to say is, I think yeah, we can remove the requirement for all low-level columns to learn a model of each object. That's true. They will only learn the object through high repetition, but we can already make predictions based on models that will learn quickly in higher regions. I think that's,
Yeah, I think it relates to that figure you pulled up before, and the example of like we learn an object through touch and then infer it through vision,
right,
where we have like a high level model of like the general features, and then each of the subcomponents have models in both touch and vision, like you know how an edge looks like and you know how an edge feels like. But you don't have a model of the compositional object in the lower columns yet. You only have that
right.
in the higher column. Um,
Yeah, so
and
we have
so you
we
can
have some
still
discussion that
infer
here,
edge.
right? And yeah, sorry, was someone else saying something?
I was just thinking, I think we also reached a conclusion where we're learning at different resolutions, where it's okay to learn also in parallel, like a higher level at a higher like a different granularity. And then basically, if you need to learn details of the lower level objects, you just do that through repetition.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, so that's basically what's stated here. So high level model, low resolution, fewer learned locations. It can be quickly learned. High resolution, low level LM will generally require many observations and is learned more slowly. And yeah, we talked about how the kind of high level LM might even be kind of more like a hippocampal complex in the case of biology. This was the first point we already discussed, so I just moved that down. One tends to attend to coarse features first when learning rapidly at the high level. However, you can also attend to detailed features and learn these rapidly at the high level where necessary. So the example that kind of informed this statement was, again, with like the hippocampal complex, for example, you can walk into a room and you can quickly see, all the pieces of furniture, kind of large objects that might be there. But equally, you can attend to something very detailed, like letters on a page, or the arrangement of objects on a diagram or whatever. And that, because of the speed at which kind of the brain picks that up, that's clearly happening at a very high level as well. But yeah, the kind of key factor is it's still not that many locations. So there's a difference between kind of locations and the scale in which it's happening. So, if you're learning a diagram and there's a lot of detail to it, that's still going to take a lot of time. Or if you're learning a whole room and there's a lot of different objects that you're trying to learn about, that's still going to take a lot of time and require a lot of capacity. It doesn't really matter so much whether it's kind of at the scale of an entire football field or a piece of paper in front of you. But yeah, what we tend to kind of notice first are these kind of course features that jump out. Cool. And yeah, definitely butt in if I say anything that anyone disagrees with. Otherwise, I'll just kind of keep going. Location space at the top could be detailed, but we may not be storing a lot of points in there. It can then interpolate between the features. If we pay attention to details, we can store more features at granular locations. I think this is kind of saying something similar to the earlier one. It just also mentions that we can kind of interpolate, which is nothing new. Learning course models first and interpolating until we fill in the details should also work at lower levels, but will require more observations as we can't rely on informative compositional inputs. I'm not actually entirely clear what's meant here. I don't know if anyone remembers if they wrote this, if they're able to kind of comment on this one.
Yeah, this was about like the general strategy should work at any level in the hierarchy, that basically we first learn a course model of the object, which allows us to make some rough predictions already just by interpolating between the few points that we stored. And that can happen anywhere in the hierarchy. But then if you're at a low level in the hierarchy, you're just getting raw features as input. So each point that you're storing isn't as informative as if you're at a high level in the hierarchy. Input is like, all right, chair at location X, and then you already have a model of a chair, so you can use that existing model of a chair to make a bunch of predictions about all the locations on the chair. So like at a higher level, you're already getting more informative inputs for each location, like entire descriptions of entire models that you know about. So fewer points help you more.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Okay, and then attentional masking to only use information from parts that are moving can help here.
I think then we went to thinking about this more specifically for object behaviors and how we can be even more efficient when learning object behaviors quickly, as far as I remember.
Yeah, okay. Can help. I'll just say with learning object behaviors efficiently. See kind of further thoughts on attention. So yeah, we later then had a more kind of in-depth discussion on attention. Oh, what's going on with Google's cursor? Can you guys see how it's like in the middle of this E here and like kind of offset?
Yeah.
Very strange. For learning behaviors in morphology, we don't need to share knowledge laterally or hierarchically. Learning just happens at all levels of the hierarchy in parallel, with learning happening fastest at the highest level. This is separate from using hierarchy to support multimodal generalization. Discuss below. So yeah, this was basically when we had entered this discussion, we had talked about how maybe there's some way to share kind of knowledge through some sort of lateral connections, or even a way to kind of share it hierarchically. What we described was basically a way for learning to happen really fast at the top of the hierarchy, which already enables us to do useful things while spending more time in the world, basically gets you into kind of expert mode by learning more models at the lowest level. But there's no kind of transfer of models between columns. And yeah, we discussed how that was kind of problematic for various reasons in terms of if we're constrained to CMP signals, it's not clear how we could do that.
And I think Jeff also brought up neuroscience evidence for like where people have shown that knowledge is not transferred from the top of like from
Mm,
the hippocampus down the hierarchy, but instead it is relearned at every level of
right,
the hierarchy over
right.
time. So it seems to
Yeah,
kind of match with biology.
yeah. Does anyone know what papers that might be referring to? Because I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. Obviously, like the classic HM finding or argument is that like he could never learn any new skill, but I'm assuming there's some what Jeff is referring to. There was some study where like with sufficient exposure, he did, or some other patient with hippocampal lesions did learn new things. It was just much slower. I seem to remember there was stuff he could learn motor skills, but that could be
Yeah.
more kind of subcortical stuff like trial and error in the basal ganglia.
Just to make sure I understand the problem and the solution. The problem was that we were trying to figure out a way where uh, we're observing different parts of the behavior at the same time on an object. And we assume that there would probably be uh, some shared learning so that we can observe the different kinds of behaviors at the same time. Um, and the solution is that because the higher regions have a larger spatial receptive field, we should be able to build a coarser model of the behavior at the higher levels. And we don't necessarily need to transfer it down to the lower levels. But we would still have this coarse model of the behavior at the higher levels. And this basically assumes that we don't need to the lower level columns, they don't need to have a complete model of the behavior.
Well, I don't think it was necessarily about the size of the receptive field or it not being able to see all of the behavior at once. I mean, I think the assumption is still that we'll have to kind of reobserve the behavior multiple times and look at different locations on the behavior to be able to learn it. So even the lower level model can learn that behavior. It just has to see it more times and kind of look at all the locations on there more often to because it learns more slowly. But
You see?
I guess to me the big question was just like, how is it practical to learn a behavior? Like when we think of our models that have like 2,000 points or something, and the object changes after a second and is in a different state now. Like, how is that realistic? But then the answer being, all right, we just need like 2 or 3 points to start with, and we can start making some predictions so we can saccade very quickly. And then the next time we observe the behavior, we add another 2 or 3 points and another 2 or 3 points, and our predictions get better and better over time.
I see. So
Yeah,
a solution doesn't really solve the problem of learning a behavior quickly in one column because we still need to do the same repetitions.
yeah.
Well, I
So
mean, we can never avoid having to move over the behavior to learn it, because even at the highest level of the hierarchy, it's not like the input is like broken down spatially. It's still just features at a location. It's not like we suddenly get like a bunch of locations at once as input.
So the
But I
idea
guess
of
the other thing is we also discuss further below the effective voting. So that does help with some of that, where if all the columns are voting on both the object but also the state that it's in, then that information can be passed up and that can inform a behavioral model that can kind of generalize.
but that's only for inference, not
That's
for learning.
for inference.
Well, at learning, you would learn, it's where it's like the stapler top, for example, is moving. So you would learn stapler top is moving, but stapler top is like a broad feature. So if you know where that is at a point in time because of your behavioral model, that can enable you to generalize to other parts of the stapler top. So that means you don't need to learn every single point of the stapler top that was moving.
But that's more like using compositionality
Yeah.
versus using voting. I mean, you can use voting to
Well, it's
quickly
both,
infer the stapler topos at the lower level, but then at the higher level where we're learning the model, it's more about like, okay, we have this
right,
compositional object already, so we again just need to store a few points to be able to make predictions about it.
right.
Yeah, during the brainstorming, I had a feeling that the idea of the horizontal spread of learning, like sharing knowledge across columns in the same region, might be promising to solve the speed. Like we don't need to do repetitions if the knowledge is being spread horizontally across the column, because they all see different parts of the behavior at the same time. But maybe we can discuss that later outside of the summary.
Yeah, well, because I guess
Yeah, I
just
mean,
two observations, like the stuff we already discussed, helps make that tractable, or at least seems like it would be tractable to a reasonable amount of observations. And then, yeah, I guess the observation in humans is that we do need to observe behaviors many times. Like people, if it's a totally novel behavior for a child or something, they can't just like zero shot or like one shot learn that in the same way that they seem to be able to learn morphologies.
Yeah.
just like the behavior you showed with the logo moving around on the cup.
Right.
You watch it like a bunch of
Yeah, it wasn't
times
like
and
all the columns just saw it
well,
and then, or it doesn't seem like that's what happened. And then they just transfer the knowledge
That's
to each
also
other.
kind of compositional in some sense. So, but like I'm talking about the behavior like the inflating of a balloon or something like that. Uh, it does feel like you might be able to aggregate knowledge from neighboring columns to because they all like feed into one behavior, and there's no compositionality there. Um, yeah.
yeah, I guess it might be a mechanism to explore more if we run into limitations of what we have so far, but I feel like what we have right now seems pretty powerful already. So, I mean, yeah, maybe we just kind of have to practically test it and see if it's sufficient or not. But it would be nice if we don't need to rely on the lateral spread of information. Because, yeah, we also don't necessarily need to learn every object in every column.
Yeah.
I have a question about the predictions. We're talking about learning quickly and being able to start generating predictions quickly. Are those predictions generated in a higher area, and do they show up in the lower area? In which case, it seems like there's some model sharing going on. Like if a higher area makes a prediction about what might show up in a particular location in a lower area, I guess is a
So when I
question.
said predictions, I was referring to like what every learning module does all the time. Like whenever you get a movement input to the learning module, it'll activate a new location in the model's reference frame. And at that location, we have stored a certain feature. So it'll predict to sense that feature. So by that definition, it would be happening at every level in every learning module that has a reasonably confident hypothesis.
Predictions basically stay within that level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then to narrow down hypotheses or like have prediction errors to then attend to or yeah, learn new things.
Okay,
But all within like constrained within the learning module.
gotcha. And so when we say learning is slower in a lower level versus a higher level, is it slower in terms of like, is there any sense at which it could be adding observations like an adjustable learning rate, or is it just because its number of observations it sees is kind of small over time?
No, it's more the learning rate, I think.
Okay. So it could
And
be
I
taking
think there's two
observations.
factors, or like well, there's probably many factors, but at least two factors we discussed before is that like in biology, it's expensive to be able to learn quickly. Like you need kind of almost specialized neural hardware to be able to make rapid connections, and that seems like the hippocampus is like specifically evolved for that, and is this big structure compared to an individual column. And then I guess the other thing is like with representational drift, you maybe don't want the lowest level representations to change as quickly as the highest ones, because the highest ones are going to kind of be using stuff that's lower down. And so there may be a benefit to the fact that kind of there's less rapid plasticity at the lowest level of the hierarchy. And yeah, those are at least two factors kind of that come up before. But it's possible that in Monty we could be like, well, okay, we don't have the biological constraints, so maybe we want more rapid learning at multiple levels. Maybe that's like a way that Monty can be superhuman, but it could be interesting, maybe there's a reason the hippocampus seems to be at the top of the hierarchy and generally isn't dealing with like very low level sensory input. And
yeah, I was wondering if maybe the slower learning rate might be advantageous for generalization purposes. Like if the learning rates are really fast, you might sort of enter an overfitting type regime on a behavior or something. But with maintaining something that has a certain degree of coarseness, makes it easier to overlay on novel objects or whatever.
yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think, yeah, it kind of, what do you call it? Yeah, no, I think that's right. Because the hippocampus or whatever is good for just like rapidly learning a like a particular instance of something. But yeah, you kind of want diversity in the models that are learned, and having these different learning rates is a way of being like, okay, some of you are going to be specialized at like learn this exact instance of something and remember it when you see it, and some of you are going to be more kind of generalists.
Cool.
Yeah, any other? Okay, so yeah, I think Rami, you brought up a fair point that it maybe wasn't that clear how some of the stuff we discussed here mapped onto object behaviors. So firstly, all the stuff we discussed that it seemed like we kind of agreed on turned into black. And then I added, so there was already this thing about kind of, we learn these coarse models and interpolate between them, and we can do that better at the higher level. So just written the above also relates to behaviors, either coarse sensory inputs, so like flow over a relatively large region, or compositional inputs, e.g. stay, flow, top, moving, enable a high-level LM to quickly learn a behavior model with a few points that already enable some basic predictions. That sound reasonable?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Maybe could you make it a different color than black, like blue or something, so we can
Sure.
distinguish questions from answers?
Sure. Kind of satisfying. Cool. So the summary is we rely on a system that will learn a few points and interpolate between them. Later, we add more detail. Helps to learn the course model at a higher level because we can use compositionality. I'll maybe just write, oh God, that's driving me nuts.
Do you try refreshing your browser window?
I'm just thinking that, yeah, maybe I should. Oh, it won't even let me.
Wonder how quickly your brain can learn that spatial offset.
Yeah,
and compensate
yeah, because
for
I
it.
think it is consistently. Oh, nice. Okay, thank you. Yeah, turn it on and off again. Always works. Cool. So, by the way, yeah, and I was thinking I'll maybe go down to here, and then just to keep it interesting, we can maybe take turns kind of reading stuff out so you don't have to just listen to me. Although Scott, feel free to bow out from that one.
Okay.
Cool. So for inference, yeah, this is where the kind of multimodal part comes in. So, and I think this was actually when it came to the hierarchy, this was where the context Jeff first brought it up in. So see if this makes sense on its own. Yeah, how do we do multimodal generalization? For example, learn with vision and infer with touch. If a high-level learning module has previously learned the association between two low-level objects or sensory features from different modalities, for example, the touch and sight of something sharp or the touch and sight of a cube, then if we encounter a new setting where we observe one and learn it as part of our high-level model, then we can immediately predict what we will sense in the other modality at that location. And so a hierarchy in this way is necessary to recognize a novel multi-feature object that has been learned in one modality and we are inferring another. For example, if we saw a complex object and studied it with our eyes, we would need to use a high-level multimodal model to slowly to attend each part when touching it blindly in order to recognize it as the same object. Yeah, I think that still sounds good to me. And then, yeah,
Yeah, that was a pretty big one, at least to me, because I feel like the problem came up many times over the past years of like, oh, how can you learn an object with your finger on your right hand and then you infer it with your finger on the left hand, or
right.
and then
Yeah, maybe that's
inferring with
another good example to include. Yeah. So,
But yeah, since the brain always kind of naturally has hierarchy, even though like most things we try to solve within a column or they start there, this is like a really neat way where hierarchy can be used.
right. So yeah, this should also work when generalized across specific sensory inputs within a modality. For example, you can learn an object one finger and recognize it with another. But then, yeah, we discussed that, sometimes you cannot generalize with this mechanism. For example, a logo exploding in visual space, and that behavior cannot/shouldn't be inferred by a touch column. Oh yeah, a logo exploding.
Maybe you say a logo moving,
Yeah,
because exploding
right.
does sound like you
Sound
could
kind of
feel
like
that.
a tactile.
Not everyone is as intimately familiar with the exploding logo yet
Yeah, not yet.
as we are.
We can bring it to the world, put it up in Times Square, make it famous. How can columns collaborate to infer behaviors? So recognize states before it's changed again. So yeah, we mentioned this earlier, but I think what we agreed was we definitely want columns to somehow share the point in the sequence with other columns. We're just not sure if this would be done through voting or broadcast by the matrix cells, at least in the case of biology. Voting could be a reasonable approach to identify where we are in the sequence/behavior. Note there shouldn't be that many elements in a sequence, maybe say at any given level of the hierarchy, such that it could be realistic to vote even on the state in the behavior. And this is where we kind of had a discussion about like, how many points is there in a song or whatever, and or, words in a sentence and in a paragraph and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and like at what point do we break it up hierarchically, like breaking up a
Right.
song into verses and into like 4x4 notes and yeah.
Yeah, right. Cool. Any questions or challenges to that? Okay, and then last one. This I think is related to the above. How does voting work for behaviors? Do we vote on behavior ID, pose, and point sequence? I might just move this. I feel like these kind of answers moved back and forth because I think they were kind of all touching on the same thing. Yeah, and then there was some discussion that it might be too much to ask the thalamus to encode the timing in the sequence in the matrix cell output. It should say specific to a given sequence. Yeah, but then I think Jeff was arguing, we shouldn't throw away this idea yet. Maybe, it's something to basically still have in the back of our mind. So I'll say
Maybe we keep this one
it might
gray
be,
since we haven't really decided.
yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, I think I'll take this one out. Okay, cool. Yeah, moving on to object segmentation. Does anyone particularly want to do this one?
I can do it.
Okay, cool. Do you want to share your screen, or do you want to read off
Could you
here?
keep sharing? I'm gonna be doing it on the other screen. I'm not logged into the Teams meeting.
Okay,
Okay.
cool.
You just scroll up and down while I type
Yeah,
or read.
yeah, and then I'll highlight as blue and stuff.
You should. Okay, so object segmentation. I think this part we're talking about a hierarchy in a hierarchy where we have compositional objects, and like for example the stapler, we've learned the morphology model of the stapler, and then the top part starts to move up and down, and we were thinking that attentional masking will allow us to do something like define an object in the lower region column, like only the top of the stapler has moved, so we basically want to only attend to that part and define it as a mask. And there we brought up some evidence from just that the TRN allows for attentional masking through the spotlight hypothesis, where it basically just um, defines an attention on like part of the like a part of the retina, basically, because the TRN is also retinotopic organized, or like it matches the retina. So that, I think that was the idea. So let me just read through
Cool.
the points.
Yeah, I might just quickly breaking this up.
So just as an overview of the neuroanatomy, basically, the TRN is just a thin sheet of inhibition that applies inhibitory the action potentials, or like effects on the LGN, which is, or the LGN, or basically the whole thalamus, but so the TRN is divided into sections based on modality. So there is part of the TRN called the PGN, the perigeniculate nucleus, and that is basically matched one-to-one with the LGN. So these are doing vision inhibition. The LGN, the TRN or the PGN receives input from two places. It receives input from the LGN, so it forms a loop with the LGN. So the LGN can excite the neurons in the TRN, and then the TRN will inhibit the LGN back. So this is like a closed loop. But the PGN also receives input from the cortex, from layer 6 in the cortex. And we were thinking that when it receives input from the cortex, that's basically model-based inhibition, and maybe when it receives input from the LGN, that's more model-free inhibition, because it still doesn't, the thalamus doesn't really have any models of the world.
Right.
Okay, so
Yeah, by the way, Niels, we have for this one, I think we have a bunch of notes at the bottom after all the
Yeah, okay,
questions,
this
like
one.
about the TRN and stuff. So just might have to sort them in there.
Oh, okay, cool.
yeah, you're better at note taking than I mean.
Oh, no, it's okay. Yeah, I just thought, yeah, while we were talking, I'll just add this. Yeah, let's maybe then, so is the behavioral able model to tend to regions of the model at any given time? So it seems very reasonable. This could be the case, and would consist of model-free tension, like input-driven in model-based tension. And then I'll add the stuff up here. Okay, sorry, Rami. Yeah, you
No,
go ahead.
I was just one thing I think we didn't really address is whether this attentional mask is going to lead to a permanent model in the lower level columns or not. Uh, like, are we using the attentional mask so that over time it basically becomes the top of the stapler is just a separate model from at the bottom of the stapler, or is it just like a temporary mask so that we can do some predictions? Um, I
Yeah,
think
I think
this.
that's kind of covered here.
Mhm.
So how do we kind of communicate outside the column? We don't communicate entire models, so it's unclear. We need to communicate kind of half model, quarter model, etc.
But this is
It may be sufficient that in the long term we will learn a new sub-child object morphology, while in the short term we can attend
Right.
to the sorry, what were you saying?
yeah, I guess it says that yeah, we might learn a model in the long term, but it doesn't really talk about how we would do that, I guess. But
Oh, that's fair.
also
Yeah,
doesn't that complicated once we
yeah,
are repeatedly invoking a mask. It seems,
right,
well, I guess it's still open questions like, does it turn into a totally different reference frame? Is it somehow still
right.
related to the previous object reference frame? I feel like there's still some open questions around that.
I could imagine if we consistently get this inhibitory signal, like basically we're only getting a mask from the thalamus, then I could imagine a way where basically the model through heavy learning starts to forget about different parts of the object that's basically not reinforced. Uh,
Yeah, so that means one column wouldn't have a model of both the stapler and the stapler top because it would kind of forget about this whole stapler once it keeps paying attention to the stapler top only.
the model of the whole stapler will be in the higher level now, in the higher region, and the parts only will be in the lower region, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, that could be. I guess it would still have to be fairly consistent because like once the stapler stops moving, we'd be paying attention to the whole thing again. So I feel like we would still be able to learn the morphology of the, or retain the morphology of the whole stapler.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, um, yeah, but a little bit on that, and then one thing I don't feel like we had in these notes, which I'm just adding now, is kind of like what are the key elements of attention? And I was going to write kind of like um, maybe there is what draws our attention to something, and there is what narrows our potential window around kind of slash sub-selects the input. These aren't always the same thing.
I think
Would
there are
you
some notes on
guys
it
agree with
below as well.
about that? Okay,
Oh no,
because there was this bit.
um,
So to me, this is top-down decisions about where to attend can be.
oh yeah, I was thinking about that bullet. I was looking at the bullet point below that says there's top-down and bottom-up attention. Both limit which columns are processing input based on where in space they are sensing. Did we put that somewhere already?
Yes, yeah. Um,
Ah, okay, I see. It's a part of the, okay. Then, yeah, I'll just delete it down here.
did we get, sorry, I think that first sentence though, maybe we didn't get.
Oh,
Because yeah, So then there is also top-down and bottom-up factors determining the attentional window.
I'm not sure I understand the distinction between drawing our attention and narrowing the attention.
Okay, yeah. So I guess to me, for example, like if you like hear a sound or something, that's a bottom-up signal that's going to draw your attention to an area. But once you're kind of like when you're actually looking at, like that's different from, I guess, what's determining what's actually coming into your retina. It's more about kind of informing your organs kind of how to move in the world versus kind of like masking what's coming in and saying like this is irrelevant.
So is that basically top down versus bottom up? Or
No, I
how's
feel
it
like
different?
top down and bottom up are in both. I I think, yeah.
Okay, maybe I'm not understanding the narrowing down part.
I guess to me the narrowing. Sorry, go ahead, Rami.
No, I was just going to say the same thing that you're saying. Narrowing down is basically that you're looking at something and then you just mask part of it, but without moving. So you don't really have to, like, it's not like you see some like you feel some stimulus in the visual field and you start looking towards it. Um, so the narrowing down would just be masking part of the input uh, without movement, I guess. But the other kind of attention is where we feel some kind of stimulus and you just move towards it and basically saccade on it, and then you start masking to that part. If that makes
So if
sense.
we start with the last bullet point, which is top down, bottom up attention, both limit which columns are processing input based on where in space they're sensing. So
I
that
would,
that includes both narrowing down and drawing the attention, right? Like it's basically just about which parts of space do we want to be processing and which do we not want to be processing, right?
yeah, but I guess I feel like it's helpful to break them apart because I feel like they're, yeah, going to be driven by different stuff and yeah, kind of different mechanisms.
So you mean the drawing the attention is like using action commands to move somewhere, like
Yeah,
over attention,
yeah,
versus the narrowing is
it's a bit more like
basically
the
saying
covert, basically.
which columns should process input, like covert attention.
Yeah, but then I guess the only confusing thing about using the term covert is generally when people talk about covert attention, it's like the very behaviorally what you call it, atypical setting of like keeping all your sensory organs frozen and trying to kind of mask out or like attend to a particular region. But the reality is these tend to be overlapping so that you move your sensory organ somewhere and then you use your kind of attentional windowing at the same spot. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
so yeah, this can probably be worded better. Yeah, let me just think. Um, so there's what it draws our attention to something. Okay, or I mean, there's attention that requires moving sensory organs to focus on something, attention that narrows the sensory inputs received given their positions. The former is overt attention, the latter is overt when we don't move our sensory organs. Really is the two usually happen together. such that we move to and to something the sensory organs, and then focus them to a window. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
And then either top-down or bottom-up mechanisms can drive both of these.
It feels to me that they're both part of the same mechanism. Like you get some stimulus, you want to attend to some part in the space in the outside, like in the field of view, but just you're not focused on it. If it's not in the focal point, then you basically go to it and like that would be the first step, and then narrow your attention, like mask it there. If you're already looking at it, then you just mask it. But it feels like these are just two steps of attending to something that's like
Yeah, yeah. I'm not trying to kind of suggest that they're totally like unrelated, or I don't know. I guess I just think it's useful because like sometimes we were using language which to me was clearly referring to like moving sensory organs, and other times it was language that was more like narrowing the attentional window, and like at least as far as the LM is concerned, in some sense they're or like the kind of sensory flow and stuff, they are very different in that like one is a movement that is causing like a totally different sensory input, and one is some way that we are processing sensory input. But I agree they kind of like happen together, and um
Yeah, I think
but
we had a similar one here, but I just changed
oh
this in the brackets to say like just processing input in a certain region independent of moving the sensors there, instead of without moving the sensors. Like you might still be
yeah,
moving the sensor, but it's about which area in space you're processing. Doesn't matter how or where you're moving the sensors.
right. So yeah, because like yeah, again with vision, like I feel the moving your sensory organs is more like there's a sudden flash, or there's a suddenly large amount of movement, so you move your eye there. But then it's like the fact that there's a big blob of movement that's kind of coherent is what tells you, oh, okay, that might be one object. I'm going to narrow my sensory input to all that. Um,
so it starts model free and then you get more model
well,
based.
like in that case, both of those are model free.
I see. Like you're just using some heuristic about the
Some,
boundary.
yeah. Um, yeah. Okay. Cool. Is that
Yeah.
clear as mud? Uh, Let me just check, sorry, before we keep going, what other stuff is down here. Yeah, this is kind of, I'll just say use this as an
Maybe
example.
this may relate a bit to what Scott is starting to
Right.
work on.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say for the attentional window, maybe what are it's window. Something like this.
Yeah.
We already have that up there. Okay, I think the other things we can get to when so I think finally we can just like read through the questions and then the responses.
Okay.
So this is what you were just saying earlier.
Yeah, so would the thalamus be involved in intentional masking? Seems reasonable given the neuroanatomy and seems to be, you just say the TRN seems to be able to support both model free and model based.
Yeah, that's a nice point. Yeah, you mean given the like L6 inputs.
Not going to begin model based basically be just a layer 6 to GM.
Cool. And then maybe one other interesting thing you talked about that would be worth mentioning is the I'm forgetting the term right now, but like the co-localization of the receptive fields, or like the as in that
Yeah,
the layout is
they're both retinotopic and
they're both random. Okay.
organized.
Yeah, and just for clarity, the PGN is the nucleus in the TRN that corresponds to the LGN, or like the part of the TRN.
So yeah, this is the parageniculate. I just call it the vision sector. Yeah.
Okay, nice. Thanks.
Maybe not LGM. There was also some more information about how the receptive fields of the PGN nucleus uh, or neurons are like basically complex, they represent complex shapes that are more reminiscent of receptive fields and like features in the cortex. Would basically be very useful if you want to, just like have an attentional mask over like an object or some boundaries or something like that, because they're detecting more than just simple
Yeah, that's a good
centers.
point. That was kind of PGN in irregular with complex features. Then something like that. And are they dynamic as well?
What do you
Because
mean with
presumably,
it?
I guess they would have to change. I don't know if it's observed
Well,
that they like change given what is presented, or like,
yeah, I would think that because they get input from the layer 6 neurons, I think they change based on the input. but I don't recall seeing that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I feel like that's what we'd want, or like it would be cool if they had that.
Yeah, and I would think also like there would be that they would like they can have combining effects if they're applied together, or I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that might be the alternative is like maybe they're a single cell's receptive field is fixed, but you can kind of like combine them to create arbitrary masks.
Could be.
Cool.
We can enable attentional masking, islands of agreements, or movement-based masking. How does a column neuron represent this attentional mask? So, yeah, so this is now only in the cortex.
Well, I guess the movement-based masking could be the model-free type masking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Discuss ideas around how a column could use sensor displacements associated with votes to predict when it will move outside of an island of agreement. Yeah, this is the island of agreement idea. I don't know if you want to go over it, Niels.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, just briefly say, yeah, it kind of like, I guess is here. We kind of already require sensor displacements to process votes. So at least in Monty, that kind of information is local to each learning module. And you could use this to kind of look at your votes and basically see if you're about to move. Was one of those votes from somewhere where you're about to go? And then based on whether that vote was from a consistent object or not, decide whether you're going to basically be seeing the exact same object you think you're seeing right now, or it's something else. And then that could inform prediction. So yeah, I guess it's a kind of form of model-based attention. So could be complementary to model free signals, and then it's kind of computationally feasible given the information that's local to learning modules in Monty, but it's unclear kind of that's biologically plausible because we've always been a bit uncomfortable with this kind of sensor displacement for voting. And then we also kind of discussed it's unclear how important it is that the column can make this prediction accurately rather than just kind of incorrectly believing the object will continue. Like it kind of gets to the whole thing of like how important is this a temporary mask in the first place? Like it feels intuitive that that's what we're doing, that we kind of have the sense that oh the object stops. And I guess we also discussed some examples of that with like static objects, which relates to this question, but maybe it's not actually necessary.
So if I understand this idea, you're talking about more of a prediction error between the sensors, right? So if you're trying to you're trying to predict some feature in the other sensor, and if you're not able to, you're saying this is a different object?
No, I think it's kind of simpler than that. Let me see if I can find the slides I had. Uh, oh yeah, there we go. So it's basically just the idea that like this column with that's getting kind of sensory information from location A is voting with these other columns at B, C, and D. The votes coming from columns at B and C are consistent with what column A is observing, and the vote with column D is inconsistent. Now, if column A is about to move, what it will look for is a vote where the sensor displacement that that vote is based on is similar to basically the inverse of the movement that's about to happen.
Okay.
And then it could basically say, okay, I'm about to move where column B is, and I got a vote from column B. Did it agree with me? If it did, then I can basically conclude, okay, it's part of the same island of agreement. We're seeing the same object, so I can use my own internal reference frame to predict what I will see at B. So it would still, it wouldn't try and get directly the like sensory information from B or anything like that. It would basically just say like, am I likely to be still in the same object? And then I'll use my own internal kind of most likely hypothesis and kind of reference frame to predict what I'll see at I. But then if it was like moving to location D, and it did that comparison between the movement and the sensory displacement between these learning modules or columns, it would see, okay, yeah, that it's similar. So I need to look at the vote coming from D rather than the votes coming from B and see it's different. So basically, I'm going to predict that I'm off my reference frame. I don't know what I can predict, but I just know that I'm not going to be seeing like whatever my current reference frame would predict. So it's kind of like dynamically determining whether we are moving beyond the island of agreement, but only for that one movement. So it doesn't try and calculate like this kind of boundary everywhere all at once.
Okay. So it relies more on sensor displacement than on actual features.
Yeah. And then I guess implicitly there's the sensor features and stuff like that comes in with like whether these learning modules agree in the first place. But yeah, exactly. It's not like it's doing a direct comparison with those.
I guess it relies also on having pretty accurate, unnoisy votes to use for this.
Yeah, I guess maybe it could help. Like if you're getting lots of votes, you can maybe pool multiple of them. Like it might not have to rely just on one.
Have we solved how voting works in general in this scenario? I mean, we could just be like, oh, it's not a stapler anymore because our votes are not agreeing anymore. So like, if
as in like
the
when you have, I
when
think
the
it,
object starts.
I think it works fine in that it's like, I think we've just maybe always assumed like there'll always be a sufficiently large subpopulation that like even though these ones will disagree, it's like all of these would agree on that. And I guess also if voting is kind of happening in different sections, then it might be like, oh, okay, yeah, we're definitely seeing a stapler, but we can't all agree on where it is.
But like node A would half of its incoming votes would say one pose and half of its incoming votes would say another pose.
Yeah.
So like how does it deal with
I
that?
guess, yeah, votes then like they can't be as important as what A itself is sensing.
Like pose isn't as important as object ID.
Or more as in like what it's sensing is only consistent with the votes coming from here. So even if it got 50% of votes from each, as long as it's what you call it, as long as its own sense of where it is like fairly significant in that, like then it's going to be an easy competition. Like so basically like the votes are just biasing it, but it's relying mostly on what it itself thinks.
But we're using the incorrect votes to modify the evidence, which may confuse the learning module because it's getting a lot of wrong votes. So it might think, oh, I have the stapler, but I have like 50% of my votes are saying it's in this pose and another 50% saying it's this pose.
Yeah, I think we definitely would have to modify our current voting algorithm. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I
Yeah,
feel like this is something we need to explore a bit more.
yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I agree.
I think
It's
our current learning modules would get confused, like Rami says.
yeah. Yeah, and I think yeah, at least what I was thinking is just like at the moment, like a vote basically has the same amount of influence as like sensory movements within a learning module. I feel like that's part of the
Well, all
issue.
the votes combined, not each vote.
Sure. But yeah, I guess. Yeah,
If
anyways.
we can figure out that this is basically a behavior because I'm getting a lot of votes from the bottom of the state without saying it's this pose, and then we can detect a behavior and then say like figure out a heuristic where we can just exclude all of these votes because we're now in this behavior model rather than still trying to detect one pose. We're just basically going to say, okay, these are all consistent with a different pose, which means this part is moving, and we can just exclude all of these votes from modifying the evidence.
Yeah, I feel like I can imagine having a heuristic where it's like I'm getting kind of two general themes in the votes. I'm gonna pick the favorite one and then kind of ignore the other one.
But
I don't
this
know if like
problem
using that to kind of like model a behavior is maybe a bit complex for one. Sorry, what were you saying, Will?
yeah, would this problem go away with compositional objects? Because then you'd be ignoring votes for the different sub-objects as opposed to different poses of the same object.
Yeah,
I think
so
once we put the stapler into two parts, that
right.
wouldn't be an issue anymore.
So yeah, in this setting, what we were kind of hoping to get working is that like you see a stapler, in the same way that like you see this phone, it's always been like one object. Suddenly half of it splits off, or part of it starts moving or whatever. Then you can like instantly be like, oh, okay, I'm gonna segment that and like treat that as its own kind of object temporarily because I haven't had time to like learn it as its own model. But yeah, I think you're right that like once we've had the kind of luxury to learn it as like a child object, then it's not as much of an issue.
And like the reason why we want to apply this mask and keep using the model is because like once it starts moving for the first time, it's not like you forget everything you've already learned about the stapler or the phone. You expect still like the colors on the stapler to remain the same on the stapler top and just move. So like you're still obviously using the model of the stapler you learned, but somehow only the features on the part that is moving.
Yeah, and like even in your head, kind of at some level, you're kind of thinking, oh, this is a stapler or this is a phone or whatever. It's just like it's part of a phone moving for some reason. But that's kind of like almost, yeah, how you would describe it. It's like, what is it? It's this part of this object I know, which is normally bigger, that's kind of moving.
So maybe we leave this in gray and add another open question about like to talk more about how voting works with object behaviors and what we might be able to use voting information for. Or like, can it help us inform learning behaviors and masks?
Yeah. As in, so there was the bit we were just talking about, like you raised about, voting might be problematic more generally. Like, but then,
Yeah, maybe. Uh, does that make sense?
yeah, I guess the only thing with this second one, I just don't know if it's too general. Like, I feel like using voting to inform recognition of behavior models, we kind of discussed like up here, and then masking is kind of what we discuss here. So my bias would be to leave it just at learning.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking to put the gray bullet above underneath this point. But yeah, we can also just remove it in general. I just thought it's worth having another whole meeting talking about voting and all this
Right,
stuff.
right. Okay, yeah. No, I see what you're saying. Yeah, maybe we. Well, how did this start? Object segmentation. Um, so when we revisit this and at some point when I'm not confused.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I'll leave that gray. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
Well, like I wonder about whether what model freeness might give us beyond just attentional masking. Like if I think about if we had movement signals that were also available, and then 2 points nearby on the top of the stapler should have the same or very similar movement vectors from time point to time point, right? And beyond attentional masking, that should give you some information that these 2 points are likely to be viewing the same object. So when they vote on what the object ID is, it feels like that ought to be able to help winnow down what the object ID is because they're basically priors now. That like whatever we're seeing in terms of whatever the object ID is, if our movement vectors are the same between neighboring LMs, then you should weight higher whatever that vote is for the object ID.
Yeah. So, but I guess that would happen at the level of the learning modules, like output. So as in like a particular learning module thinks, okay, I'm seeing stapler moving, because they wouldn't vote on like sensory input. But yeah, I think to your point, like, yeah, there's movement happening, and so they would infer that the stapler is moving, and they would
Right.
be agreeing about what direction and speed or whatever the stapler is moving. And so they're going to be much more likely to think, okay, yeah, we're
Yeah.
seeing the same stapler than LM's maybe seeing the stapler not move at all or whatever.
Yeah, you're
But
basically saying like maybe the model-free sensory input already contains enough information, like it's already informative enough to create these attentional masks. And then having those attentional masks would actually help us solve the voting problem by saying, all right, anything in this kind of model-free defined region can vote with each other.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like a pre-screening of agreement islands, sort of. So I don't know. It's not totally clear in my head how they interact, but it feels like there a lot could be leveraged with um the movement
Yeah.
signal and maybe various stages. But
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to kind of look for coherent optic flow or something like that, because that's a pretty simple feature, but can't think of an example where it wouldn't come from a like object that moves.
yeah.
yeah. So I'll write here maybe. So under more generally, how can we work on subject start knowing? The model-free knowing could help limit agreement by ensuring only kind of relevant LMs are processing in their one another, something like that.
Yeah, should we add the coherent optic flow somewhere as a potential bottom-up signal? I mean, I guess we have regions that are moving, but maybe also moving together as an additional factor.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, maybe Rami, do you wanna...
Yep. Can, or should this information be communicated outside the column? I assume we're talking about the mask. And would we want to communicate that outside the column? Not really
Yeah, maybe
sure
I'll
what.
say a model-based mask.
So this is like a.
So irrespective of how it's derived.
Okay. We don't communicate entire models, so it's unclear. We need to communicate half models. Yeah, because it's not talking about an object ID, it's talking about the actual model, all of the associations between features and locations and all of that. Do we want to?
Yeah.
It may be sufficient in the long term. We will learn a new sub-child object morphology, while in the short term we can attend to a particular region. Yeah, I would agree. Probably don't need to. I'm not sure.
Yeah, should we make the language stronger?
Yeah, I would just
Uh,
remove the last part of the sentence and say we don't communicate whole models, so we don't communicate half models either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Like
that.
everything up to the dash, I think we could take out there because the second bullet covers, talks about, what does it?
That's more asking how we learn the new
New
child
child
object.
Yeah,
So I feel like at least the way I read it, it's clearer with the.
yeah, but then in the last part of that sentence, we should make sure that, like, while in the short term we can attend to a particular region, that refers to this region being defined inside the column and not shared.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so while in the short term, we can use attentional masks. You mean kind of like that?
Local attentional masks or model free.
Yeah, maybe I'll make it clear here. We don't communicate, so we don't communicate attentional masks outside of the column.
But like implicit, like if we have a model free mask, that gets broadly distributed by basically telling which column should be processing the input and which shouldn't. So in a sense, that mask gets kind of broadly applied already. And then this question is more about like if there's a top-down mask.
Yeah, this is asking if a model-based mask should be communicated outside the column.
I feel like it will be like
I
the second step. So
up through the hierarchy maybe is I think what this is specifically getting at.
oh, you mean like the subcomponent becomes part of a parent model?
Yeah, as in like, so, okay, we know it's a stapler top in this column. Is it telling the higher level learning module, by the way, I'm just a stapler top, or like I'm just part of a stapler? That's kind of what this is asking.
Well, that really depends. Are we changing the object ID or are we sending the same object ID? Because if we're sending the
That's what
ID,
I was trying to imply here is that over time you would learn like a slightly different or totally different, that's a different question here, object ID. That's that child object, but you wouldn't develop that immediately.
But then the last part doesn't make sense to me. I feel like in the short term, it's just you just don't have that information at the higher region if we can't communicate the mask.
Yeah, I think that was more referring to that particular learning module that has it, but maybe that's not necessary. Just to specify.
Yeah, how would we prevent the higher model from thinking that there's actually two staplers, I guess? Like
I
instantially.
guess with the with at least the way we have compositionality, it doesn't really matter because that's kind of what happens with like the Numenta logo. Like the higher level learning module thinks there's, if it's like a weird, like it just thinks there's a bunch of Numenta logos in some sense. All it knows is there like is Numenta logo at a particular location.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, remember that the hierarchically arranged columns have co-located receptive fields. So it's not like the higher region gets inputs from all of the locations on the stapler. It just gets input also from the top of the stapler where the lower region is sending its input from. So yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it raises an interesting question like, how do we count child objects?
Yeah.
Like how would a high level learning module know, like you say, Scott, like how many staplers there are? Which I guess is just interesting to think about because yeah, we can count objects. It's like the
Well, why do we need to count the child objects?
oh, I'm just saying this is now moving beyond anything we've kind of talked about recently, but just like as a ability of intelligent systems, at least humans, like we can count things. So it's like if in our compositional models, like generally we're kind of like we keep laying down points every time we need to capture the structure. But then it's kind of like, okay, so we can't just count like how many points there are associated with a particular object at the high level. That will like overcount. So it's almost like, yeah, we don't have to talk about this now, but like, yeah, it's like when you have a point, you're somehow saying, okay, this is now a different instance of this same object from this other learned point.
Especially if one is like, if you have a logo that is like bent halfway and you're storing two different poses, I think the high level LM will probably think that these are two different objects, two different child objects.
Right. Yeah, we can, I guess, get to that another point, but yeah, I think it's an interesting question you brought up, Scott.
Is there more general?
Oh yeah,
I think like another point that we talked about attention was I brought up the point that like maybe we are getting that the learning modules might not need to like store an attentional mask because what if it is already getting sensory information, it is already something that is attended to like it, so like the attentional mask doesn't need to be represented in the column at all, but like it's I guess my mind was more like related to sensor modules and learning module. Um yeah, like I'm not sure if this makes sense, but gosh, I remember thinking that like okay, like maybe this is not like an object behavior thing, but like a generally whether we're trying to recognize an object, like a static object or a behavior, we are already attending in both cases. Um And I think my question was like, can we assume that learning module is already, if it's processing something, it's because we are already like attending to it. So like, yeah, I think it's a question. I think I asked it like, do we have attention for, I don't know, for free in some sense? Because just by the nature of like we're doing something about it means that we were, but the prerequisite of that is that we're attending to that. Maybe I should just like write it down as a question. Just
yeah. I mean,
uh,
my understanding, I think, is what you're describing is like, is model-free attention sufficient? Because the model, for it to be kind of model-based,
Right.
has to be involving the cortical column somehow.
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah, that's maybe one, if I'm understanding right, that's maybe one way of wording it, or yeah. I think the other thing is this kind of grayed out question that was here, which is like, it's unclear how important it is that the column can make this prediction accurately rather than just increasing the believing the object will continue. Like this basically gets at the question of like, is what you call it, is model-based attention necessary?
Yeah.
Well, I guess at
That's
least in the sense that we can use the models to guide our attention to a new location, like move our
Yeah,
sensors
that's
in
why
and
I
out.
said, sorry, attentional windows.
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Like, yeah, model-based masking. Yeah.
So we're assuming that any sensory information that goes into a learning module has to be processed. And this is why we're doing the attention outside of the learning module in the thalamus. But I think if I understand OJ's question correctly, if we already have that signal of what we want to not process, why can't we do it in the learning module directly?
I know what you said in the beginning is what I was saying, but much better.
Okay, so
Yeah.
but then this is a so can we do that attention direct? Like, can we just ignore some of the points that, like some of the input that we're getting from the thalamus, if we already know what the attention mask is and what we want to process and what we don't want to? Or is that
Isn't that what we're already doing? But the idea is like either the signal for that is model free or model based. Like it can be based on simple heuristics like things that are moving together, or that there's kind of like a large flat area with some edges and stuff like that. Or it can be model based, like, oh, I know what stapler looks like or whatever, so I'm going to focus on the area that the stapler actually occupies based on my
yeah.
hypotheses.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, does that kind of relate to also what Scott brought up of whether already the model-free attention mask is quite powerful and it might actually solve some of the later processing, like the voting disagreement and stuff, if we just rely on model-free signals um, for the most part for this kind of masking.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I'm happy that I did this quickly. We can move on from now. I was just want to remember that, I guess.
How do we learn
Oh,
a
sorry, I
new?
was muted. I think we, yeah, got to here.
Okay. How do we learn a new child model? Does it have entirely new reference frame? I think did we cover that already?
Yeah,
We kind of
it was
alluded to
gray.
it.
I just made it turn it into a question because it's
Yeah,
the
which we don't have to
question.
discuss now, I guess. Or I don't know,
Yeah,
unless I don't think we have any
Yeah.
good answers. This is a controversial topic.
yeah.
I think the bias would be to create a new reference frame because, like Vivian was saying, also we sometimes we need to recover the whole model, and sometimes we don't. We just want to have like an intentional. But if we're applying a temporary mask, then we don't need to create a new one. So yeah, I see why this is controversial.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think I agree with you about the model. I think it's the SDR overlap thing. That's maybe the
Yeah. But also
so
for a temporary mask, then it means that we're sending the same object ID, and now the parent object would not know that this is just only a part of the object, not the full one.
I mean, yeah, that would be my bias as well. Maybe we can just write having zero overlap would provide the benefit of in the commonality in the child and or child no what's the break off and original. I feel like if we use the term child, it's going to get confusing. Break
Well,
off
it would
kind of makes
become
sense.
a child object. So
Yeah, but it's I don't know. At least in this case, like a single learning module might have a model both for the whole stapler and this kind of break off thing. So there's no like hierarchy within that learning module necessarily.
Yeah, there's also the issue of having a stapler and then at some point taking the stapler apart, like unscrewing the hinge. If I unscrew the hinge and pull off the top, it's not like I have to learn a brand new model um, of the top of the stapler after I completely separated it from the rest of the stapler.
yeah, it seems like we transfer some of the knowledge, perhaps. I would make this gray because I feel like we're not like certain enough about this answer
Sure.
yet. But yeah, Scott, I think it's a good point.
I don't know if this is actionable, and hopefully this isn't backtracking too much, but I was just thinking about the islands of disagreement. And in just the really restricted case of the stapler motion, the actual, if there was more than just disagreement, but disagreement was specific in some way, so whatever the angular distance was or whatever, that would be enough to encode where you are in the sequence, the behavior sequence.
In terms of as in like all of these are agreeing on like a kind of like sequence identifier or
Maybe I should just try to think. This might already fit into a model that we already have. But I'm just thinking about the particular, these agree and say this orientation, these agree, say this orientation. Step two, these agree, say also a particular orientation relative, let's say relative to this orientation. Knowing the relative orientations of disagreement does, in this very small example, define the location within an entire behavioral sequence, which would be this. I mean, maybe that's already something we already get out of the parent-child relationship. So yeah, that is probably something that already shakes out of the parent-child relationship, actually, now that I think about it.
no, I mean I think it's interesting to think about it. Maybe it's kind of similar to something Rami was asking or suggesting earlier about like learning based on the kind of disagreements and the votes. It just feels
Right.
to me like voting isn't a great place to kind of represent that because it's
Yeah,
maybe
I
I'm
think
wrong,
it's
but
like there's got a voting will be used to get these two poses and child object IDs, but then to represent it is better to do that in the parent column.
Mhm.
To say at this location we have stapler ID at pose X, and at this location we have stapler ID at pose Y,
Mhm.
versus somehow having to like learn that out of all the messy votes coming into the child column.
Right. So in that sense, it's kind of tying it back to talking about voting on the location within the sequence. Um, Maybe that is better done at the higher level. I don't know. Might be too much at the lower level.
or yeah, like they could vote on where they are in the sequence, but they wouldn't try and store like yeah.
I mean, how would
I
you
mean,
know
I
where
don't know,
like
maybe
what's the vote on at that lower level?
but yeah, maybe if it's consistent enough. But I guess that's the kind of part of like voting is like it works best when they're all kind of consistently have the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think it would work with voting because we can't do coordinate transforms and stuff. It wouldn't generalize to new like relative orientations and things like that. So I think that's why we need to do it with the parent-child relationship, because there we route things through the thalamus and store relative orientations and relative locations in the parent's object's reference frame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess we kind of do coordinate transforms. Well, but yeah, we can probably get rid of that.
I
But
have a
in what
question
you
that
would learn between the agreements, you would have to learn that. Like you can't just do like hypothesis testing between vote agreements.
Hypothesis between both agreements.
Like stapler top pose A, stapler bottom pose B in the votes are very specific rotations. They're not a relative location to each other. So if you want to learn that association, you have to learn that association for all the possible poses the stapler could be in, versus if you send both of those poses to the parent object, we store the relative orientation to the parent object. And we route all of the
No, I mean, I agree.
orientations
Yeah,
through
we
the
would have to
thalamus.
store, you'd have to store for the vote the relative offset and then kind of transform it kind of similar to how we ensure that they're all agreeing on the rotation.
Yeah,
I
but
don't
what
know.
would be the point of doing
Yeah.
that?
I think, yeah, we can move on.
So some more mechanism.
oh, so I can ask my question. The yes, the so this section, I know it's called like object segmentation, but the mostly questions about attentional masking, and I realize they're like related. But does anybody remember like why we were trying to model like the break-off like object in the first place? Like what was the like? So I mean, this is greatly beneficial for like learning, compositional objects, like so that we have like a stapler top and also a stapler, but we have a mechanism for already learning compositional objects. And I guess this can like speed things up, as in like if the stapler top like truly broke apart, like we don't need to necessarily explore the entire stapler, top to create that model, but it will kind of exist because we have observed some kind of behavior. But I guess it doesn't seem like it's helpful, but not necessary. Uh,
So
yeah, so
yeah,
I just
it was
forget
trying
like
to
why
address
we
that
were trying
question
to
of
do
like,
this.
yeah, like so with the stapler, a lot of the times we've discussed behaviors, we'll have like the stapler model, and that's what's known. That's the morphology we know. And then suddenly
Right.
part of the stapler moves. And so we talked about how like, okay, it would make sense if we kind of what you call it, mask that out, and it's like, okay, it's only part of the stapler that's moving. So that's
Right.
the connection to behavior. So it's basically like, how do we use kind of a fixed morphology model we've learned in the past to kind of adapt it to be able to learn a behavior once it kind of starts moving?
Okay. So I think that makes sense when we have like LMs that are kind of sparse and it's not looking at the entire stapler. We want to know that only the top is moving and not like the whole stapler is kind of rotating together, but only kind of this part is moving. But when we have like in your example where like learning modules are covering the entire stapler morphology, like in your PowerPoint, um, then we automatically know that only this part is moving because we're not storing any behaviors from the bottom part because there's no change in locations. So, right?
Um,
Oh,
sorry, you're saying high level
talking-
learning module. So any, just to clarify, I guess any learning module in this diagram is only seeing part of the stapler.
Right. Yeah, any learning, yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Uh, yeah, but if we kind of if we were to be able to gather, like, okay, like, where are the locations of these learning modules? Because I think we can know that by which sensor it is attached to. Like, I'm assuming that there's like a sensor to every learning module, and the sensor knows
Yeah.
its location. We consolidate, okay, like which of the sensors that were lighted up or attending, then all those points together would form an attentional mask, and right, and then that can be applied to the morphology model to learn the uh, break-off object.
If I'm following you, it sounds like, yeah, you're describing kind of a way we might do the attentional masking,
Yeah, and I think my
but it
question
sounds like we
might morph
still
into something else.
need
Yeah.
it. I understand.
But I think
Or like it could
if
be
we
beneficial if we're trying to use a fixed model.
But if we do go with a solution that is more general to any kind of object deformations, like not the case where there's like a big chunk of the object all moving together. So like that was the idea of the attentional mask, that we can just apply it to that chunk on the stapler and make the same stapler predictions, just rotate the entire stapler model. But if we have total object deformations, like the stapler is made out of wax and you can kind of bend it and all this kind of stuff, then that solution, the attentional mask solution, doesn't actually help much anymore, or you would have to make very tiny attentional masks. So maybe if we do go with a different solution, we wouldn't need them anymore. Or we at least, like, they might still be useful in the sense that we could use the model free attentional mask to tell us which parts are moving, and then use that to inform, like, what is the subcomponent of the object that I want to learn a separate model of. So basically, oh, I'm only gonna pay attention to this part, so only those learning modules are gonna get input who are on those parts. So naturally, they will learn a new model for this kind of subcomponent on the object. But we wouldn't use attentional masks anymore for making predictions about morphology.
Yeah,
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 I guess
that's
unless it's
that,
like a more efficient, I don't know if the distortion stuff takes more time to like learn and model, but
yeah.
I guess maybe if you have ones that you can grab that you've
If
used before.
yeah, if you can use, like, if you can match existing distortion models to a new morphology, it would be very quick. But yeah, if you'd have to relearn it, then it's
Like the
not quick.
like the new logo behavior, or
Yeah.
like uh,
Yeah. So I guess attentional mask like may not be the criteria. It may not for always for always creating a child object. Otherwise, if you have deforming stuff, then we might be creating like infinitely many child objects. Like it's a good criteria. Like if something is kind of moving all together, like that's a good candidate, but maybe it shouldn't be like the only necessary requirement. Um,
yeah,
and I have another. Sorry, that have many questions that will pop. Like if we have the mug, mug with a logo. Sorry, I'm not using that right now. Uh, and that was the only mug that ever existed. Would that be a compositional object or just one object? So like all the mugs in the world are just TP mugs, like white TP. Uh, would we still, in that case, like there's no point of making like a child object for the logo. Okay, so let's say
The logo appears in other places.
yeah, I was
Or
gonna say like
letters
let's say
appear
the
in other places.
yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say like maybe not the logo is not a good idea because it can appear in other places, but like a completely unique design. I don't yeah, never mind. But
no,
yeah,
but
I don't think
yeah,
it's
I
an
mean, I think
issue.
it gets more towards like a yeah general like questions about unsupervised learning and stuff. But yeah, like one example that I guess relates to this is like handles. Like handles on mugs are pretty much always associated with mugs, but we also seem to have some sense of that they are like their own thing. And so we maybe learn that through affordances and stuff. So yeah, I think there are complex questions about like how do you basically decompose the world based on,
Okay.
sometimes you can rely on statistical dissociation, like things will appear consistently on their own, separate from other things, which your example was kind of breaking that. But even cases where that is broken, like kind of handles always appearing on mugs or noses always appearing on faces, we still have some way of kind of saying, I'm going to kind of think of that as an object. I don't know. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Um,
But yeah, this is
Definitely some
helpful. Right.
mysteries. Cool. We've got 7 minutes left. Should I just try and quickly whiz through the rest of the segmentation
Yeah.
stuff so we can at least say that's done?
Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. So is there a more general attention mechanism? Could the same mechanisms be used for compositional objects? So I'll just say the voting ends of agreement mechanism would, in theory, work for static objects, but see more general concerns around information required. And then maybe we can say like model free signals for no masking would work in many situations, I think is a fair statement. And then maybe I'll keep this one gray.
Yeah, sounds good.
How can object behaviors be used to we turn an intentional master into its own model? I think we've kind of, I might delete this question. I feel like we kind of already covered it with like this stuff.
Yeah, we added a question that already existed.
How do we define child objects for continuous substances? Okay, yeah, this is a good one. Like a rubber balloon, a cloth, or liquid. Do we do so at all? If not, how do we apply our solutions to behavioral modeling? Maybe. See you later. I feel like this is kind of your proposal.
Yeah, maybe you can just say see object distorting behavior
See object
section.
just or distortion maps.
Yeah, and then or models to make it more consistent. Object distortion models.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then maybe say if we do go with a more general object distortion mechanism, we might not need attentional masks to make predictions about morphology.
Yeah.
Do you want me to write that down?
Sure. I was just thinking, yeah, where we write it, but yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, and then I guess the only thing though was like the if a behavior is totally novel, that it might still be helpful. Like
You
the
mean the
exploding,
behaviors?
like the exploding logo.
If the behaviors, it's a new behavior morphology combination, or you don't have a model
new
of the
behavior.
behavior at all.
Yeah, new behavior.
Because I feel like that's a totally different scenario where we first have to learn the behavior model.
Yeah, but I mean, it's one we've been discussing, right?
In terms of applying behavior to morphology, I feel like it's always we already have a model of the behavior and we already have a model of the morphology. We just have never applied them to each other. Like we have never seen this particular object.
Yeah, like
open.
that's definitely one question, but I thought it's also a question of like how we learn, like even like the concept of like stapler opening and closing and stuff like that.
I thought we already have the solution for that part before we learn that. It just takes some repetition, which is why the logo was difficult to learn because we needed to observe many times to build this new behavior model. Like we couldn't just take an existing behavior model and apply it, even though we tried it for some of the components.
Yeah. I guess I'm just wondering whether attention is playing a role when that's happening. It feels like there was definitely some, but yeah, maybe more model free or whatever, bottom up.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say attention plays a role there, but I'm not sure if we would use attentional masking.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
In that,
I'm rereading what you wrote. Yeah, we wouldn't need attentional mask for making predictions about morphology. I agree with that. Yeah, it wasn't that we don't need attention.
yeah, as I added in brackets at the end too, like we would still want attention for other reasons.
Okay, cool. And then we have these two other things in a new scene. Yeah, this was just something that kind of Jeff said that I paraphrased. I think could be classified under a kind of feature of attention, which is like in a new scene, attention may be broad at first and then narrowed down. This doesn't necessarily need to be a simple circle of attention becoming narrower. E.g., if we threshold attention regions by the movement spatial frequency changes, these regions can be dynamically made smaller or larger as required, still remaining regularly shaped. That makes sense. I think it was just kind of an interesting point he brought up in terms of if we come to develop attention in Monty, bear in mind. And then, yeah, there was also this discussion about like priming. When you have a specific task, e.g. find object X, you would already be using top-down attention to bias which models to update and use the input for. But then, yeah, we kind of discussed how attention may not be the best term for this. It's more priming a column for which object to observe. It doesn't match an object. It won't try to match. If it doesn't match the object, it won't try to match other objects.
It's about like it uses Monty terminology. Like if that primed object
okay, okay.
then it will not try to consider other hypotheses. It will just go on and say the object isn't here.
Yeah.
Maybe say if it doesn't recognize that object, it won't try to recognize other objects.
Or yeah, or
maybe
just even it will only try to recognize the specific object. It will only recognize specific object. Fine for be essentially blind to other objects. Okay, cool. I feel like that was actually like I know it was only 2 of those sections, but that was still a lot to cover. And there's quite a lot of blue.
Yeah.
Found that pretty helpful. I would do that again.
Okay, cool.